So 1,500 years ago, there was a man by the name St. John of the Cross. He was a priest who lived in Spain. And he ended up writing a piece called The Dark Night of the Soul, which ultimately explains why very well-intentioned, spiritually minded people can go through hell. And actually why it's a required part of the spiritual journey, going through what he calls the dark night of the soul. And I'm going to explain it as briefly as I possibly can, finishing with some of his words from the text that he wrote, but using some science concepts and just some practical ways of visualizing this, so you can see why it is, if you've ever gone through any type of deep suffering, some deep pain, why it's actually part of the process. Why it is that Apostle Paul says, I am with you in childbirth. Someone like him was recognizing there's a process of rebirth going on. As Jesus says, you're born once of the flesh, but a second time of spirit. And that second time was born again. I'm going to show you what the born again looks like very precisely, using the concept from St. John of the Cross, the dark night of the soul. So it starts with this recognition. You are a spiritual being, right? That's the only leap of faith you really have to get. Because once you grasp that, you're a spiritual being, everything else falls into place pretty nicely. You're a spiritual being. That spiritual being can sometimes just be called your highest self. Other people would say that that's God, or your connection to God is found at that spot, okay? So any of those words work, but it's you. It's your essential you. It's your essence. You're a spiritual being. At some point, known as your birth, or perhaps conception, or somewhere in between, you cross a threshold. You go from being an energy being to being a physical being. Truth is, you're still the spiritual being, much like water when it freezes is just slowing down, it's condensing. The spiritual being just condenses into matter. Water in ice form is still H2O. When you take on a physical form, you're still your essence. You're still the spiritual being. This is really the E equals MC squared part of things. Einstein said different manifestations of the same thing. We go from our essence, we take on a physical form, it's a different manifestation of the same thing. E's over here. Here we got the MC squared. That's all the stuff, all the mass and the matter in the universe is over here. Now I drew it as little pixelated dots because it's not really flesh. It's actually energy. Here I've got a pixelated man and a pixelated dog and a bird, and that's the sun. Well, over here in the flesh world, I've got it like in a womb of sorts. It's in a container. You're still your essential you inside this flesh world. Well, inside this flesh world, there's a lot of stuff that you can do. The science of superposition happens here. It's infinite possibilities. A lot of things can happen inside this womb, if you will. It's in this womb where something shows up called the ego mind. The ego mind is the flesh mind, the flesh-focused mind, and the separation mind. See, this is where we all came from and where we're all one. When we come in here, we're still all one, but now we're seemingly separate. That's what the ego mind is. And that mind is a pain in the butt. It's going to beat you up throughout most of your life. It's going to cause separation. It's going to cause pain. It's going to cause suffering. It's going to cause arguments. All the issues, all the negative issues that the world's ever experienced happened because we forget who we really are. We fall into this flesh world, and then the ego mind shows up. We have tons of experiences while we're here. And while we're in the ego mind process, we often slowly develop towards a process called awakening, where you start to realize there's something else going on here. I'm not just this physical being, I must be something else. Well, we just talked about what the something else is. You're not the physical being you think you are. You're a spiritual being. This eliminates all of the labels that we put on each other. This eliminates the racial issues and gender issues and or sexual orientation issues and political issues and all of that, all the stuff that we argue about, because at root, we're all coming from this place of oneness. Over here, lots of stuff to argue about, but everybody's in the same position. So whatever it is you're looking at, race or gender or political affiliation, sexual orientation, all of that, each one of these people have the exact same thing going on. They're in this womb of sorts. Once you get yourself to a place where you have this awakening going on, this is where the dark night shows up. You'd think it would be the other way around. You'd think all of a sudden as you start to get more connected to the light, it would just be easier. But St. John of the Cross says, no, that's when the dark night shows up. Now, I'm going to read a verse or a line from it in a minute, but let me tell you what it's in essence saying. You get yourself to a place where there's an awakening that's happening to you. But you, with the ego mind still present, aren't fully capable. You and the physical are not fully capable of completing this job. Something has to happen to you to get you born again. That's when you enter this dark tunnel, and I drew a big, long, dark tunnel here, because you enter into the dark tunnel, which brings to mind a couple different great classic works of literature. Dante's Inferno. In order to get to heaven, he first had to go through all the different layers of hell. In Goethe's Faust, he had made a deal with the devil to have a great experience here on earth. But at the end, his mere desire, despite the fact he had made a deal with the devil, his mere desire to find his way back to heaven was sufficient to get him there. And the Steve Miller Band had a classic song, Big Old Jet Airliner. In order to get to heaven, you gotta first go through hell, right? So whatever concept you come from, you're gonna go through this dark night. Now, in this dark night, what happens is you get detached from the ego mind forever. You have to go into this place of the dark night, because to get through this tube, there's only one thing that you need to do. You have to lose this ego mind. It becomes useless. You're not going to think your way through this. You're not going to be able to use your brilliant wisdom and all your great acts here. You actually have to walk by faith. This is also known as the third eye. Even though it's extremely dark, you're going to get to a place where there's just one voice back inside of you, one voice that keeps you going, one that guides you. So here's how St. John's described it. In order that the interior motions and acts of the soul may come to be moved by God divinely, they first must be darkened and put to sleep and hushed to rest naturally as touching all the capacity and operation until they have no more strength. Therefore, O spiritual soul, when you see your desire obscured and your affections constrained and your faculties bereft of their capacity for any interior exercise, be not affected by this, but rather consider it a great happiness, since God is freeing you from yourself and taking the matter from your hands. For with those hands, however well they might have served you, they would never labor so effectively and so perfectly and so securely as when God takes them and guides you through the darkness, as though you were blind to an end and by which you know not. Nor could you ever hope to travel with the aid of your own eyes and feet, however good of a walker you might be. Which means whatever a great Christian or a great Buddhist or a great Jew or a great whatever you think you are as a human being, you still aren't capable of walking this walk until you've put it all down. That would be considered a crucifixion. Because the only voice that matters is the divine voice that you started out as. Your highest self, this voice of God, which is you, that's the trick. See, you walked into this is really the darkness, and in order to get back, that's called being born again. See, when you get to the end of this dark tunnel, this voice has guided you all along was your voice. It actually came from you. It was that highest self all along that was always there from the moment that you were born. He continues, for this soul now, as it were, is undergoing a cure in order for it to regain its health being God himself. So you started over here as a spiritual being. You went through a bunch of chaos. Oh, it might have been nice for a while, but at some point you're going to have to walk the walk. And you're going to have to do what St. John says, is walk as you were blind in the darkness, because from there you see only the light guides you. And that brings you back. This is why in James 1, verses 2 and 3, James, brother of Jesus, says, consider it a joy when you face trials of all kinds, because that brings about persistence. And why Apostle Paul in Romans says we must rejoice in our sufferings, because our sufferings brings about endurance, right? To get through this dark tunnel takes endurance. It's a faith walk. And everything was seemingly going so well, but then it's all taken from you. And while it's taken from you, if you can believe, especially if you believe you're an awakening being, and you're going to get tested at some point. I don't like that word that much, but it works pretty well. You're going to have to walk all the way through this tunnel, and then you realize who and what you always were, this spiritual being who had just gone through this illusion of a physical experience. Who does this apply to? Everyone on earth, right? This is what makes it fair. That suffering phase, that dark night phase, it may be physical, it may be difficult physical challenges, or it could be just emotional. You could go through an emotional hell even though you have amazingly good things going on physically. This just comes over people at times. And then when you walk the walk through faith, that's the third eye, right? Because you can't actually see, but you're seeing the pathway until you end up being born again. And of course what you were, what you discover at the very end, God himself.